The Clean were just too loud and radical when they started out for pubs, and they had the power cord pulled on them early on by one pub, and it kind of angered them in some way, but in other ways it would have confirmed they were on the right path. A boring pub pulled the power cord on them and said, "That's enough, boys. You're too loud, you're too wild, you're too radical," which is exactly what they wanted to be.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. I'm Eric Senich. Before we get started, if you'd like to support the podcast, get episodes commercial free, sign up for the Backstage Pass from Patreon for just $5 a month. The link in the show notes, or you can go to bookedonrock.com. Our guest is Richard Langston. He is the author of The Clean. In the Dreamlife You Need a Rubber Soul. The Clean were one of the most influential underground bands to emerge from New Zealand, helping define the Dunedin sound and laying groundwork for indie rock as we know it. Richard, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Eric. Great to be here. The Clean love tour in the United States, and it gave the band a second life, so it's great to talk to you.
We were talking about that before we started recording. They did some touring here. You mentioned, let's talk about the influence behind this project, because you mentioned Sam Elworthy from Auckland University Press first suggesting this book. And then it was also a comment from the band's David Kilgore that influenced your decision to finally work on the book. Tell us about that.
I had such admiration for The Clean. The idea of writing a book about them kind of overwhelmed me, because I thought, how would you do that? It looked like a mountain to me. But gradually over the years, Sam Elworthy from Auckland AUP approached me and said, "You should write a book on The Clean." And then David Kilgour said, "Yeah, it's time, write one on us." And so I had suggested to David, sort of half-heartedly, "I'm thinking of writing a book about Flying Nun." And he said, no, write one about us, which surprised me, because David, the Clean, you wouldn't say they marketed themselves with any kind of aggression. I mean, they just played their music. That was how they got their audience, how they earned their reputation. So they never had a manager, they never had a publicist. They did everything themselves. And they were pretty modest about what they'd achieved. And so it was really neat when David said, "Write one on us." It gave me a boost and a confidence. And I'd done a book previously with Todd from Hozak Press in Chicago. He had turned a fanzine that I'd done in the 80s on the Dunedin bands into a book called Pull Down the Shade. So I had confidence from that. And so all these things fed into the idea we should do a book, Eric. And we quickly settled on the idea of it being an oral history, because we all like that form. I love that, where you hear the voices of the people involved, not me trying to synthesize it and superimpose a storyline over it. You get the direct storyline and experience.
You started writing this after Hamish Kilgour passed, and another founding member, Peter Guttridge, passed away. You had archived interviews with both. What was that process like for you to be able to reconstruct their voices, essentially, through previous interviews, and know that you were able to get their stories before it was too late?
Hamish had been a great talker throughout the Clean's lifetime, and that he had so many ideas. He was kind of always happy to talk about The Clean and his philosophy. He had quite a philosophy about music and how you should make your music. That's the most important thing. Don't think about it as a career. It's a creative process. So staying away from the record industry was a major idea that Hamish had. So he'd done a lot of interviews, and I had interviewed him several times over the years. The last time in New York in 2014, when I went to the USA. So there were lots. And Peter Guttridge too had been a good talker. They were people with ideas. They were thinkers, so they were always quotable. And he'd done plenty of interviews like Hamish, Peter. And then David Kilgour, during the process of writing the book, unearthed or brought so much stuff to the surface from his archive, letters, Hamish's diary, his poetry journal. So suddenly I had all this first person material, all their thoughts, what they're listening to, what Hamish was listening to, what his thinking is at any given moment. He was voluble in every sense of the word. And anyone who lived with Hamish said that he was always writing, painting, drawing. He was just endlessly creative. And even in David. So I was slightly worried, Eric, that I'd start. Hamish had given his blessing to the book, and I was slightly worried we wouldn't have enough of his voice, but in the end, we got plenty of it. And I think, he remained, he's such a strong presence in the band and such a strong presence in the book. And so Peter's appearance in the book is less, but he's there more or less throughout the story. So he again, he's a strong creative presence. And Peter Gutteridge and David Kilgour were making music together right until the end, up until 2014. Peter sort of needed music for his own mental health, and he would play these minimalist piano pieces at David's place. He would come around, they would get stoned, and Peter would start on the piano, and David would accompany him on the guitar and record him. So they were great friends, even though they would have times when they needed just space from each other, because these are creative people, so they
Sure.
and they're strong personalities with strong beliefs. So
For those listeners and viewers who may be hearing of the Clean for the first time, how would you describe their sound, and why are they so influential to the indie rock explosion that came after them?
they have so many strings to their bow, in that they made straight garage pop in their first single, Tally Ho. They made absurdist pop with a song like Beatnik. So they were very they listened a lot to the garage bands, to Nuggets is a bit of a signpost to their sound, and those Pebbles compilations are there too. They loved surf music. They loved drone. They loved the Velvet Underground. They loved, the dissonance. So they could be a pop band. They could be, a noise. They could create great sheets of sound in a song like "Point That Thing Somewhere Else," which is a classic drone song. And I mean, you'll hear lots of similar sounds in bands like Yola Tango and Pavement. So the Clean, the Feelies, that were very much akin to those US bands, I think. The Clean also had elements of the Kinks in them and the Beatles, and they were huge Rolling Stones and Dylan fans. And you can hear, say, the Rolling Stone kind of sway in something like Anything Could Happen, which was another very strong song from their very early days. They were incredible, Eric, in that they wrote what would become their kind of anthemic songs between 1978 and 1982. They had they had difficulties in that period as well, but while they tried to settle on the right combination of a band, but they had written these great songs so young. Kilgour was like 17, Hamish was 20 when they wrote these fabulous songs that continue, even though the Clean were kind of left field for New Zealand music at that time. Well, they started a whole new genre, really. They really financed Flying Nun, the label that many associate with the Clean, until they signed to Merge in the USA. Again, Eric, they were always going to sign with indie labels, so when their relations finished with Flying Nun, they signed with Merge because they're an independent. They like those people, so that's how they operated as a band.
I was going to ask you, how different was the New Zealand scene from what was happening in America and the UK at that time? Because they originated in Dunedin and 1978, right?
Yeah. Well, there was a tiny pocket of punk in New Zealand, but the Dunedin strain of punk was way different to the English strain. Because um, the Dunedin bands, like the Enemy, was the first punk band in Dunedin, and that was Chris Knox, who many of your listeners will be aware of through his solo records, his work with the Tall Dwarfs and Toy Love. And so and they combined kind of, the Stooges and the Beatles. So, it was very different from the English punk. Dunedin punk was never straight punk. It wasn't about social upheaval. It was about about making better music in that sense. I mean, also a sort of a noise against the boredom of life in Dunedin, because it's a small, slow town, and it was a way of creating excitement. But the punk was different. It was a very New Zealand strain of punk, although that was in Dunedin. In Auckland, they were more copyists of British punk.
Oh, really?
But yeah, they were more fashionable. They wore leather pants and sort of had the haircuts and everything. Whereas the Clean just did their own thing, looked their own way. They had a style that they established from the outset, which was their own style. It was more probably Rolling Stones than the Sex Pistols.
Yeah, I definitely hear the Velvet Underground influence and the Stone,
Oh,
early Stones, like
yeah,
mid
yeah,
60s
definitely.
Stones. Yeah. Yeah. The Kilgour brothers, Hamish and David, what were they like as personalities and creative partners?
Well, they were very strong personalities, and they both believed in what they were doing. They had their struggles in terms of trying to find an audience. It took them really till 1981. So they'd started in 78, but by 81, they were white hot. I mean, they would have made a name for themselves immediately if they'd been a band in the USA. So they would have been, they definitely. But in a way, it was an advantage that they incubated in isolation in New Zealand, did their own thing, because there's no real prospect of making a career here as such in terms of money. So you just got on and wrote the songs you wanted to write. And the Kilgals, I mean, they were very symbiotic in the way they wrote and played music and produced music. They had very similar ideas, but of course they're brothers, and that gives them this unique blood kind of relation alchemy between them, whereby they could finish each other's guitar breaks, or they were very close in how they went about creating something. Initially, Hamish because he'd been a kind of lit grad, he was more the writer of the lyrics. Although David wrote the lyrics to the first song they released, Tally Ho. So, but he was the guy who introduced David to the beat poets and all that stuff. So he was, and he wrote Anything Could Happen. Hamish wrote that, and it's very Dylan-esque in its language, which he got to Dylan through probably Ginsberg at university, and he was a real, but very symbiotic, Eric. And of course, over the years, they could have their differences about how they were going, what they should be doing. But
Sibling rivalry?
yeah, well, rivalry and just some sibling differences. Just they both had the same aims, but yes, they had different styles of doing it. Hamish was a bit more wild in the way he wanted. In the latter part, he was a little more. When I'm saying this, when they were starting to make the latter albums, and in the 2000s, Hamish was more wanted to jam the songs. David was into structuring song structures more. So that created tension between them. But that was only later on, pretty much, through the early recordings, their first album, Vehicle in '89, Modern Rock, Unknown Country, Getaway. They were really working together really well. I mean, they always had their differences. You're going to, with band members.
Sure.
And Robert Scott, the bass player, who they got on board in 1980, and that helped transform them into the band they would become. Robert's a brilliant bass player.
Yeah, I was going to ask about him. He comes across as an incredibly artistic and musical guy.
Oh yeah, incredible. Look, he's a very modest guy, Robert, and he doesn't say much, but the Robert and David played with a young drummer at the launch of our book, the Clean book. Um, and Robert's bass playing is so propulsive, it just sets a song going, and so David's got all this room to work. So and Bob became a very good songwriter himself and developed. And yeah, the Kilgals were tough on Robert by their own admission. They were they were demanding of him. But Bob was a genius in that he never took sides when the brothers were in dispute. So he was kind of like this UN police officer who would step back and try and maintain the peace. So, and he's just so musical, Bob, and it's easy to underrate Bob, but man, the guy's written thousands of songs, and many of your listeners probably know the Bats, his other formidable band. So yeah. So what a combination, the three of them, and what they could do was magic.
You mentioned Flying Nun label. Let's get into that a little bit more. The band has been described as the most influential band to come from the Flying Nun label. Give us the backstory of that label and why that's important to the Clean story.
Yeah, well, it was very important. So Roger Shepherd, he was working as a record store manager, and he had the idea. See, so Roger was in Christchurch, which is the largest city in the South Island of New Zealand, and he thought he was seeing a lot of bands in Christchurch he thought were really good and maybe should have been recorded. But they never got recorded. Bands like The Vacuum, which was Bill Doreen, who's a major figure in New Zealand underground music as well. He's got a band called The Builders. And Roger was a music fan. He'd missed them being recorded. And then once he saw The Enemy and The Clean, he could sense there was something coming out of Dunedin. And then he saw The Clean again in 1981 in Christchurch. And they were so white hot then. He was just convinced they had to be recorded. So he saw them I think it was in April 81, play a pub called the Gladstone. He was there. Within 2 weeks, he registered Flying Nun as a record label, specifically to sign The Clean. And because he recognized in them, basically they had the qualities of a world-beating band. And but it still surprised him when their first single, Tally Ho, which is, garage pop. It was not the kind of stuff that was played on the radio. In fact, The Clean never got played on the radio, hardly at all in their early days. Um, but it still went into the top 20 because suddenly there was this post-punk audience. Suddenly the young people were dictating. Our generation was dictating what made the charts by what we bought. We weren't worried about what they were playing on the radio. It was just word of mouth. This great music was suddenly mushrooming, flowering out of the ground, out of Dunedin and out of Christchurch. And so that's why Flying Nun was started by Roger. And then, it was a fantastic thing that happened. And The Clean were so popular, they generated income for Flying Nun, which allowed Flying Nun to pay for other bands to be recorded, released. So the Clean were massively important, and they were always communal. They were a generous band who wanted others to flourish as well, and that was part of their philosophy. They were quite sort of they wanted socialist Marxist in their outlook, whereby the artist should keep control of their material as much as possible. And if you're going to go to a label, make sure it's one that's symbiotic, that is empathetic with your aims.
Is there a good story behind that name, Flying Nun? There's a
Well,
television show back in the day.
well, one of the other influential figures in the whole rise of Flying Nun, Doug Hood, who recorded much of the Clean music early on, he thought it was a stupid name, but it was Roger. It was just a pop culture thing, The Flying Nun series with
Right.
Sally Field
Yes.
was a huge hit in New Zealand, So we all watched it. So when Roger named his label Flying Nun, I mean, we didn't think too much about it, except, well, yeah, okay. Well, it had a ring to it, Kind of probably weird if you hadn't watched the program.
I
What, a
love it.
flying nun? What is a flying nun? Anyway, but it worked, Weird things can work, and that
Sure.
worked.
How important was Peter Gutteridge in the early formation of the band and what led to his early exit? He wasn't there long.
Peter was really important, and that would be shown in that David and Peter would be lifetime buddies with different occasional differences. David had a copy of Neil Young under his arm when he was at school, and Peter, they were both at the same high school. And Peter saw David with this record and introduced himself because Peter was also a huge music fan and had very firm ideas about how a band should sound, even early on. And so that was that relationship that started the Clean. It was Peter Gutteridge and David Kilgour who first jammed Clean songs into existence, including one which became a kind of an anthem called "I'm in Love with These Times," which Roger Shepherd later used as the title for his memoir. Um, so so Peter was super important and creative, and so but he was a how could we say, he was a not he might have been an erratic character. He Early on he certainly wasn't as committed to his bass playing as the Kilgals were to their guitar and drum playing. They were really obsessed with getting better, writing better songs. And Peter's attitude was maybe not the same. And so when actually it's strange, Eric, they played a blindingly great gig at a high school, and Martin Phillips from the Chills organized that gig. It was a lunchtime gig, and this was April 1979, and they played this amazing gig. And Peter was there, Hamish and David, and within a week they kicked him out of the band because they just didn't think his playing was up to it.
Those days, though, the band's playing gigs at local schools, a lunchtime show. I mean, that's something they in the States they did too.
Well, the Clean's earliest gigs were in halls, because community halls, that's where the whole Dunedin sound, the whole scene flourished because they were too young to go into pubs. And also the pubs, uh, which were the main music venues at that time, really just wanted cover bands. They just wanted, staid kind of rock of the times. Well, that was not what become the Flying Nun bands were about. They were about creativity, writing great songs, being inspired by your heroes, Lou Reed, Bob Dylan, the Stones. They were not about
The Doors was
replicating.
another influence,
Yeah,
right?
the Doors huge, and the
The
Seeds,
Birds.
the Birds. You can hear all of that in the wash. Um, so pubs were just the Clean were just too loud and radical when they started out for pubs, and they had the power cord pulled on them early on by one pub, and kind of, well, I guess that had two effects. It kind of angered them in some way, and but in other ways, it would have confirmed they were on the right path. That a boring pub pulled the power cord on them and said, "That's enough, boys. You're too loud. You're too wild. You're too radical." Which is exactly what they wanted to be. They don't want,
Yes.
And now look at them. Those cover bands. Bless them. They don't have a career now. The Clean have continued. They sell more records in the United States now probably than they sold here. I mean, it's a wonderful, wonderful thing that people recognize in their music a quality that just endures. They were never fashionable. They created their own fashion. Here they were melding the 60s and 70s to the energy of punk rock, So and even then, the music they liked from the 60s and 70s was always more left field stuff, They liked a lot of psychedelia and Love and all the bands that are now regarded as the classics, but maybe people at that time didn't recognize so well.
I did ask about the Flying Nun origins, the origin story behind that name. What's the story behind the name The Clean? Where did they get that?
Well, let me quote Hamish Kilgour from the book. There was this community of people who would listen to records in Dunedin who were really influential and around the Kilgour brothers and that early scene. And one of them was a character, Jeff Ruston, who imported a lot of stuff and played stuff to the Clean, like the Flaming Groovies. But Hamish, the origin of the Clean's name, let me quote Hamish from the book. Um, One of the bands that Jeff had imported was a single by the Mumps, and Hamish says, "I heard the Mumps. I like to be clean single, and thought that's a kind of cool name for a band." And then there was this Hell's Angel in a movie called The Sweet Ride. This Hell's Angel had a bald head and was called Mr. Clean. So clearly, and I get it's a great name. I mean, it's such a good name. And,
It is.
Hamish was good like that. He had a good ear for language and what would stick. And I mean, look at the Clean is stuck. It's a great name.
Yeah. Richard Langston is the author of The Clean. In the Dream Life You Need a Rubber Soul. By the way, that title is a reference to.
It's a latter single written by David Kilgour. And I love that song. And I mean, the book could have had many titles. The most predictable would have been, Tally Ho, acknowledging their early successful single, or Anything Could Happen, probably one of their most popular songs. But we didn't want that. The Clean never do the obvious thing. And in discussion with the band, there was always lots of discussion with the band about the book. It was a very symbiotic communal process. Certainly wasn't a case of me writing it. No way. It was a very communal process. And I love that song, In the Dream Life You Need a Rubber Soul. It's on Mr. Pop from 2009, their last album. And I mean, typographically, it looks fantastic on the front of the book.
It
We had a
does.
great designer, Katie Kerr, and she did a great job. And it really maximizes the fact that the Clean were an art band. The book stands out in bookshops. It just looks great. In the Dream Life, You Need a Rubber Soul. It's a kind of mysterious what it could possibly mean. I mean, it might be a poke in the eye of the boring middle class life about how you have to compromise all the time, so, or any, and it's a magic single. And I wanted to remind people, or maybe intrigue people who didn't know the Clean's music, that, they were writing songs, great songs, right up until the end. They were across 35 years, more or less. And so, but they're well known for their early material, and I just wanted people to be reminded that they did a lot more than those first kind of foundation songs. They did, they had 5 albums and so many great live shows. My God, a live band, as anyone who saw them will attest, they simply took on a whole new level of creativity. And the Velvet Underground clearly an influence, and just extemporizing more like a jazz band than a rock band. You never knew where they were going to go, and sometimes neither did the bass player Robert Scott, who would hold the line of the song while the Kilgour brothers were jazzing off in all kinds of directions. I mean, David's a mercurial, creative guitar player. Hamish also, a very by-feel drummer, and so they would create this kind of metallic magic when they played live. I just They were just, oh man, they went to another level, Eric. It was just glorious.
There is a great story in the book about a studio telling them they had no commercial potential. Then that was proven wrong with their 81 single Tally Ho, number 19 in New Zealand. And it was Flying Nun's first hit. It cost just $50 to record, and that's become legend. How did that song come together?
Well, they were still writing it. David was still writing it right up until they recorded it. He hadn't finished the lyric. On the Saturday night, he played at the pub. They recorded it on the Monday. And on the Saturday night, he's kind of mumbling some part of the lyric because he hasn't finished it. He and Martin Phillips from the Chills worked on it and finished it for the recording. But the absolutely catchy, hummable keyboard riff was written by Robert Scott on his parents' piano in Christmas 1980. And they played it for the first time in February 1981 at a university hop gig in Dunedin. And they played it a few more times, and it was kind of catchy. The audience noted it, and that's why they recorded it as their first single. But it was done in classic clean style, fast. Was recorded in very little time in an unusual studio in Christchurch, which was basically a guy's lounge studio, so not a flash studio by any means. I mean, the Cleans knew from the outset how they wanted to sound. They'd recorded themselves on a two-track in 1980, in the summer of 1980, and so they knew how to record themselves, but they thought for a single for the Flying Nun, maybe they needed to go somewhere slightly more sophisticated, but it turned out to be, not exactly state-of-the-art studio, but they still achieved a great sound. I remember at the time, Eric, because I had seen them on that Saturday night play, and they were like, wow, a wall of noise and pop and just fabulous. And when we got the single, I do remember thinking, oh, this isn't quite the band I know. I mean, no single can represent all sides of a band, but it just didn't have the power that you're associated the Clean with. But of course, as the years have gone on, we all love it, of course. It's just if you are a fan of Question Mark and the Mysterians, 96 Tears, you'll immediately recognize a kindred spirit, in that song.
Yeah. You mentioned Martin Phillips. He wasn't an official core member of the Clean, but he was an important figure in their
Oh,
orbit and the broader story. Talk about how he entered the story of the Clean and his importance.
Martin organized that gig they played at the high school. He, he Martin was, he was like the Kilgores and Robert Scott in that he did not want the 9 to 5 life. He wanted to be a successful songwriter and in a rock band, and he wanted to, initially. The Velvet Underground and the Clean were massive influences on how he went about writing stuff. His early songs, Kaleidoscope World, like that, Rolling Moon, you can hear the birds, and the Clean. The Clean were huge influence on his Martin's first big hit, really, underground hit, Pink Frost. That's purely the Clean guitar sound he's approximating there. But he was a talent, Martin, from the outset, quite rebellious for a middle class boy. And he became the Clean sound person and toured with them because they liked him. I mean, David was particular mates with Martin. And they took him on a tour in 1981 when they went around the country and when they recorded Tally Ho. So he ended up playing the keyboards on Tally Ho as a kind of reward for having been the sound guy on their tour. Martin said he didn't really do much, but David Kilgour said the most important thing he did was he ensured the guitar was always turned up because David's guitar was always turned up because inevitably the venues would turn the guitar sound down because it was so loud, so huge. But Martin was under strict instructions. Do not turn the guitar down. And then, that's a winning formula.
Yes.
Keeping so yeah, and they were lifelong friends. Peter Gutteridge, Martin Phillips, and David were tight,
And the book suggests that the band wrote and recorded very instinctively.
Hmm.
Was overthinking the enemy for the clean? I mean, how important was spontaneity to them?
Well, it was. I mean, I think they had the idea first take, best take,
Yeah.
and when they looked later on, when they had made their early records and later on, so they made, the first two EPs, the first two singles by between 81, 82. They then made Vehicle, a straight record, and a straight pop record made at the end of a tour, which is quite a straight ahead but great record, but straight ahead, like with it's over in 29 minutes. Brilliant. It's like the Ramones. Um, then they wanted to branch out, and when they looked to get other musicians into play, they got this great extemporizer, Alan Starrett, who was a multi-talented, multi-instrumentalist, and he could come in and play as soon as he heard what the Clean were playing. So it tells you they always wanted people who didn't need structure, who could just do it on the spot, and that was their philosophy that they wrote quickly, they created on the spot so much stuff. You get Robert, David, and Hamish in the same room, and you will have songs. That's the way it worked for most of their career. It was only in the latter part when Hamish and did have some different ideas that didn't necessarily gel with David and about how to make the records that it became less than ideal, but otherwise it had been very much a chemical process between them that it just worked. They were the perfect combination: drums, bass, guitar. And then Alan comes in and adds hammer dulcimer, all sorts of things. So, that again, yeah, great.
You mentioned Vehicle. That album came out in 1990. And what's interesting is so from their formation through they broke up in 82, got back together in 88. Were they just extended play records, singles? There was no full album,
No, they didn't. No, they had EPs, two
EPs,
EPs
singles.
and two singles. And it wasn't until they recorded a Vehicle in 1989 at the end of their first overseas tour to the USA, the UK, and Europe that they made their first full album, you know. And that's their first album, Vehicle.
That's unusual or usual for New Zealand?
Well, at that time, it made sense for Flying Nun financially to release EPs.
Okay.
That was the favored format of the day. Financially it was better, and I I mean, the Clean could have easily made an album, easily.
Right.
When
They had plenty of
I
songs.
mean, yeah, I mean, but it worked to make EPs, get them out, get it 6 song, 7 song EPs and release them. It just worked. That's what Flying Nun based itself on in those early days. And it was bands all produced an EP before or a single before they made an album.
Right. Boodle, 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 1981.
Yep. Great Sounds Great, 1982. And Getting Older, the single was also 1982. That's on some days that's just my favorite Clean song. I love that record
Okay.
because it's where they married the garage to Phil Spector, the symphonic, it's got lots of sounds in it you can't explain. And they love dissonance. And there's Robert Scott playing a sort of sad trumpet line into the cavern of a piano. Again, you see, that's just improvisation that they decided the trumpet sounded better played into the cavern of a piano. It's typical of them.
Why did the Clean break up in 82? Just as the momentum seemed to be building.
I think that was largely driven by David, I think. But Hamish also, they had this idea that, well, they got too popular in a way, and they wanted to make music, but they didn't necessarily want to be publicly recognized and have people sing their lyrics when they passed them in the street, which was kind of what was happening. But there were other factors involved too. David had been, he says in the book, he needed a break from being with Hamish, who's his older brother and kind of a father figure as well, because his own father was unwell for periods of his life. So um, it was a pretty intense relationship. For 4 years, David had left school and been in the clean, and I think he just needed some space. And although, so he gets the space, they finish the clean, which shocked everybody. We were, oh no, you're kidding, we've lost our great band. What's happened? But in fact, over the long term, we look back now and know it was a good move because it would establish a pattern where they would come together, tour, make a record, and then disband again. And they did that right up until they made Mr. Pop in 2009. Well, made it in 2007 and 8, released in 2009.
Interesting. Like psychologically, they felt like
Yeah, they just needed a break. And so then they made what's a lovely, lovely home recorded record, The Great Unwashed, Clean Out of Our Minds, it's called. And it's such a good record. It's fantastic. It's got a couple of clean songs leftover clean songs that they recorded, but left over in only the sense that they hadn't recorded them. They're really terrific songs. Hold On to the Rail is one of them. It's a great song. Um, so the Kilgour brothers made this record as The Great Unwashed. And Bob started his band, The Bats, and started recording EPs, and then they made this fantastic EP called Singles as The Great Unwashed with Peter Gutteridge on board. And that got a lot of attention, that second record, because it's really a fantastic record. It's very spiky and songs are great. Can't Find Water, Boat with No Ocean. Peter's songs. Peter was prolific. Peter Gutteridge was prolific in that period, and he was stoked that he had David and Hamish to play his songs, and they made this EP in Auckland at the end of a tour, a crazy tour, which you can read about in the book. Insane. They often made life difficult for themselves, those boys.
yeah.
Nutty tour, but just fantastic stuff. And that EP, wow, yeah, many people talk about that in very hallowed terms. I love it and played it heaps.
Is it after they got back together from 1988 moving forward when they started to gain a fan base in the US? Like New York, they became like fans knew their music deeply in New York.
Yeah. Well, the Homestead label in the USA released a compilation in 1988 of clean songs. So you could say it was almost like their first album, and that it had all the best stuff off the two EPs and the singles. So it was a great compilation. So that introduced a lot of people, like the Yola Tango people, Ira Kaplan, and the like, heard that for the first time and went, "What the hell is this band? Wow!" And the pavement people also heard it, and no doubt, guided by voices, maybe they heard it too. So that record was influential, and then they toured, and people saw them. And I always love the quote from Yola Tango's James McNew, who saw them in New York in 1989, and he was so blown away by them. He said, "I couldn't believe that they were actually here and playing before us." He said it was like seeing the Easter Bunny.
Right. Yeah, well,
It's
because they were mostly New Zealand and then playing
Yeah,
shows in other places other than the US so they start playing in the US late 80s. Is that when they start?
the first tour of the USA in 1989.
1989. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, and they played New York, Boston, and people. See, a lot of they'd been played a lot on college radio, and also a very influential publication, Forced Exposure, which was Byron Coley, one of the writers, wrote a lot about Flying Nun and really latched onto the clean. He loved them, and he loves them to this day. He saw them. At that time, he says in the book he was against reunion shows, and he wasn't going to go and see the Clean, but he said he made an exception because it wasn't really a reunion because they were writing new songs and he'd never seen them. And he was just blown away by them. He said they were, I can't remember the quote exactly, but something like, he said they were just ridiculously good.
Yeah. They were like
And
cult
so,
heroes to the
yeah,
American underground scene at that time.
yeah, yeah,
And that's,
yeah.
I would think that's exactly what they wanted.
Yeah, I'm sure they would have anticipated that a US audience who were listening to college radio would immediately recognize the qualities in their music. The Velvets and Love, West Coast Psychedelia, the Birds. I mean, they would have recognized those classic USA sounds, because that's what the Kilgars and Robert Scott had listened to a lot. Although they'd listened to a lot of English music as well, Swell Maps, etc. So the Beatles, of course. So, but I think that's why, they would have recognized it, but it would have sounded different from anything they'd ever heard because it's got a very New Zealand accent about it, that music. Yeah, for me, it was the most New Zealand music I'd heard as a Pākehā New Zealander. If you're Māori New Zealander, you're what you would regard as the sound of this country would be a very different thing. But for me as a Pākehā, growing up in New Zealand, when I saw the Clean, I thought, okay, that's it. We have this band that is ours and that is just fantastic. And those things came together and kind of made us happier to be here, to be honest, because New Zealand could be a pretty backward place in many respects, but suddenly we had this band that was just world-beatingly exciting, and it was the sound of us. That I still think they have quite a New Zealand accent, and of course Hamish Kilgour would sing some of those songs like Side On in a kind of mock New Zealand accent because that song is a kind of mocking New Zealand's just going with the flow, just our slackness. And
Yeah.
actually, part of Dead End, just not really celebrating our culture, being a bit down on ourselves and, just taking the easy way, not something about what does it say, father and mother, bread and butter. It's, just taking the easy, boring suburban life. And that song was kicking against it. So he sang in this New Zealand accent, which I always loved.
The book, it doesn't shy away from Peter Guttridge's long struggles with addiction. There is something moving about the fact that he found a degree of recovery later in life. He sadly passed in 2014. Hamish also sadly passed in 2022. How should those two guys be remembered?
I mean, to me, that they should be remembered for the honesty of their expression. They expressed what it was to be human, emotionally. They wrote about their fears, their loves, their difficulties. So they were artists in the true sense that their human expression was really important to them. That you communicate a truth without being too highfalutin about it. But you try and write a song that's honest, and that's why I think their songs will always resonate because people recognize that someone's trying to communicate to them, and they're writing an honest lyric that's talking about the human condition. Often, Peter wrote a beautiful song called "Universe of Love," one of his latter solo recordings, absolutely beautiful. And I mean, Hamish, um, in a straightforward little song like "Someone" off Vehicle, it's about always trying to find someone to love. So without being really bald about it. They were good writers who really thought long and hard about what they wanted to convey in their lyrics. So that also gives their songs, longevity.
Did the band effectively come to an end in 2022 after Hamish passed?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, those latter years were difficult and for the brothers to record anything. So Yeah, I mean but there was always the prospect they might do something else because that's the way they were, and something might have happened. Um, they actually tried to make another record in 2012, um, during just post the earthquakes in Christchurch. And I've heard some of it, and there's something was going on that was good, but it just didn't. They didn't get it. They never completed the song, so they did have a last recording session, but it didn't quite work out. So it's never going to see the light of day. But hopefully, some of they will put out a live album because really that should be done. I think it'd be one of the few things that would justify a double live album. And one day I hope Merge will do that because honestly, I had the pleasure of re-listening to a lot or hearing for the first time a lot of their live tapes from 1981 at the Gladstone. There's one that's just you could just release it, and one of the people who interviewees in the book says, yeah, in '81 they could have just released that.
Is it off the soundboard
It's off the
recording?
soundboard. It's Paul Keane, who was a great friend of theirs, recorded it at the pub. That actually they took one song off it, Platypus, and it was the B-side of Tally Ho. But the rest of it, including one song, Quick Step, they did a version of Quick Step, and it's wow, it's 6 minutes 43, and it's just fantastic. It's a band at the height of their powers at that period, and one day I hope Merge will do a live album because seriously,
Right.
it should happen. There's so much material. Adam Jacobs, who the New York Times has just done a story on him. He recorded 10,000 concerts, and some of those are clean concerts. So they're worth hearing too. So that's that. Sorry, I can't remember the name of the site where you find them, but yeah, there's lots of recordings of the clean that are great that should be released in my view. I hope they see the light of day because to me, like I say, they added a dimension to their songs when they played live.
Sounds like they were an amazing live band. How should rock history remember the clean?
Oh, well, I think Rock History will keep remembering the clean, Eric. I really do. It's just one of those bands. And I think they'll always be discovered by people who like a certain sound, and it's a classic sound if you're into, well, I'm loath to use the term alternative rock. It's just great music to me. Um, but if we have to pigeonhole, that's probably a reasonable one. They were definitely did their own thing from the outset. And I think that people will always recognize in them that quality, that there's just something magic about them, and they'll always appeal.
Yeah, and this book is the definitive story now that people can go to. It's out now. The Clean and the Dream Life You Need, a Rubber Soul. Find it wherever books are sold, Amazon, all the usual places. Go to bookdownrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore and tell them to get a copy there as well. And people can follow you online, Richard. Where can people reach you?
Yeah, online. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook, talking about the clean, posting lots of extra stuff, photos of the characters who I interviewed, lots of extras. And I'm so grateful to Christina Ward from Feral House. Man, she turned that book around in a hurry. And, that is just, I'm so grateful because the clean deserve to be widely read in the USA. It's where they, as I say, got a second life, and they loved touring there, and they were just enamored with the whole rock and roll culture of the United States whenever they toured there, and made many great friends, and they're grateful for that.
So many photos. I mean, there are a ton of photos in this book put together
Oh,
beautifully. I mean, all
yeah, I
these.
mean, and the early photos, Eric, in the at the start of the book, they had their mates were all creative, and they just took great photos of them. Those black and white photos, yeah. The, there's one where they're outside a fish and chip shop in Dunedin, and it's just a great shot. It's with a broken window.
It
Yeah,
is
yeah.
full
The
shot.
Chills bass part player Terry Moore took that photo.
Yeah.
And their friend Craig McNabb, who he photographed them on and off for 30 odd years, he took great pictures of them.
Look at this, just gives you the vibe right here. The Enemy Practice Room gig, 1978, with Chris Moody leaning on post. To
Yeah.
his left, Hamish Kilgour, Miles White, and Doug Hood. But that just tells you the scene back then, you know?
Yeah. If you flick back a few pages, Eric, you'll see the early black and white double page spreads that were taken. These were pictures by their mate Craig McNabb, and he, like
Oh,
I
we're
say,
talking about these ones here?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Look at that. I mean, that's
cool.
just so cool. They've got a look there, street cool, I would call it, op shop cool.
Yeah, hanging out outside the, it's like a
Yeah. So,
deli or
uh,
something.
I mean, a book on the clean had to look great because they
Yep.
always look great as a band.
Yeah, they just look cool,
Yeah, they are.
unassuming, cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. So many great pictures.
Richard Langston, man, this was great. Thank you so much for coming on, and you know, all the best with the book. It is out now, so people go out and get it. And this, I was introduced to the clean through the because of this book. Getting ready to
Great.
interview him. Let's give him a listen. So you got a new fan. You got a new clean fan.
I'm stoked about that, Eric, and
Yeah.
thanks so much for having me on. I love the clean. I love talking about them. So thank you.